Ethan sat in a worn wooden chair by the window, staring at the distant mountain range shrouded in mist. His thoughts wandered back to one of the most harrowing experiences of his training. It wasn't just a test of endurance. It was a trial meant to teach him how to survive the unknown. At the time, he was still new to the world of the supernatural. Gabriel, his mentor, was the kind of man who spoke little but said enough to keep you on edge. Gabriel stood at the foot of the mountain, his gray beard catching the early morning light. He held a compass and a small bag of protective items in one hand, his expression calm but firm. "You need to climb to the peak," Gabriel said, pointing toward the distant, fog-covered summit. "Find a stone, one that feels right. Bring it back before sunset. Do not stay in the mountains after dark." Ethan frowned. "What happens after dark?" Gabriel's sharp gaze met his. "This mountain has a history. You don't want to find out what it is." Ethan didn't press for details. He had learned that Gabriel's warnings were not to be ignored. Slinging his pack over his shoulder, he began the ascent, determined to prove himself. The morning was peaceful. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled patterns on the forest floor. Birds chirped cheerfully, and the cool air carried the fresh scent of dew. Ethan marked his path by carving symbols into tree trunks, a precaution Gabriel had drilled into him. Every few steps, he glanced back to ensure his marks were visible. Despite Gabriel's ominous warning, the mountain seemed tranquil, even welcoming. By mid-morning, Ethan found a large oak tree to rest under. He sipped water from his flask and allowed himself a moment to enjoy the stillness. "Maybe he's just trying to scare me," Ethan muttered, but deep down he knew better. Ethan pressed on through the mountain path. The sunlight, once warm and inviting, now seemed subdued. The trees, which earlier swayed gently in the breeze, stood unnaturally still. Even the cheerful birdsong had vanished, replaced by a deep, unsettling silence. He glanced up at the sky. The sun was still high, but the light felt weak, as if something unseen was sapping its strength. Shadows stretched longer than they should, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Instinctively, he tightened his grip on the small pouch of salt at his waist. Gabriel's warning echoed in his mind, "Stay vigilant. The mountain can test more than just your strength." Ethan's attention snapped to a rustling in the nearby brush. He froze, his heart pounding. Slowly, he turned his head, scanning the area for movement. At first, there was nothing, just trees and thick underbrush. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A deer stood a few yards away, its body partially obscured by the mist. It stared at him, unblinking with dark, glassy eyes. Something about it felt wrong. Its gaze wasn't the timid curiosity of a wild animal. It was piercing, as though it could see straight into his thoughts. Before Ethan could react, the deer let out a low, guttural sound, something between a growl and a cry, and bolted into the forest. Ethan shook off the encounter and continued walking. He reached into his pack for the compass Gabriel had given him, hoping to check his bearings. When he opened it, however, the needle was spinning wildly, refusing to settle. "What the hell?" Ethan muttered. He tapped the compass, but it was no use. It was as if the mountain itself was rejecting the concept of direction. He looked around for the marks he had made earlier on the trees, but they were gone. The rough carvings he had made had somehow smoothed over, leaving no trace. "Impossible," Ethan whispered, a cold sweat forming on his brow. The weight of the silence pressed down on him, and for the first time that day he felt truly alone. As the fog thickened, muffling even the sound of his own footsteps, Ethan heard something. Faint, deliberate steps, crunching leaves in the distance. The sound grew louder, closer, circling him. He stopped walking and strained his ears. The footsteps stopped too. He spun around, trying to locate the source, but saw nothing but trees and mist. "Who's there?" Ethan called out, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. No reply, only silence. And then, just as suddenly as they had stopped, the footsteps resumed, now faster, moving closer. Ethan's pulse quickened. He fumbled for the salt pouch and threw a small handful in a circle around his feet. The footsteps halted abruptly, as if the salt had drawn an invisible barrier. For a moment there was peace. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it again. A shadow darting between the trees, impossibly fast, and then it was gone. The fog thickened, swallowing the world around Ethan. His steps grew cautious, every sound amplified in the silence. As he moved forward, the faint rhythm of chopping echoed through the mist. Thwack, thwack, thwack. The sound was steady, methodical. Ethan followed it, curiosity mingling with unease. As he approached, the source of the sound emerged. A man standing near a fallen tree, swinging an axe with slow, deliberate motions. The man, dressed in worn-out flannel, didn't look up as Ethan approached. His face was obscured by shadows, and his movements were unnaturally smooth, almost mechanical. "Excuse me," Ethan called out hesitantly. "Do you know the way down the mountain?" The woodcutter paused, his axe mid-swing, and slowly turned to face Ethan. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, but his expression held a strange, unsettling calm. "Lost, are you?" the man asked, his voice gravelly, like wind through dead leaves. "This fog, it confuses many. Sit for a while. When I'm done here, I'll guide you down." Ethan hesitated, scanning the scene. The man's axe looked old and dull, yet it cleaved through the thick wood with ease. Stranger still, there was no cart or tools nearby to carry the chopped wood. Just a neat pile of logs that seemed to vanish into the fog. "I think I'll keep looking," Ethan replied cautiously. "Thanks for the offer." The woodcutter's expression didn't change. "You should wait," he said. "The fog can be dangerous." Ethan's grip on his pack tightened. There was something off about the man. His voice, his movements, even the way he stood perfectly still, as if waiting for something. "No, really, I'll be fine," Ethan insisted, taking a step back. The woodcutter's eyes followed him, unblinking. Then he raised his axe and swung it at the tree again. Thwack. The sound echoed unnaturally, louder than before, reverberating through the fog. As Ethan turned to leave, the man called out, his voice cutting through the silence. "Be careful. Not everything on this mountain wants you to leave." Ethan quickened his pace, putting as much distance as possible between himself and the woodcutter. The rhythmic sound of chopping followed him for far longer than it should have, growing fainter but never quite disappearing. He stopped to catch his breath and realized the fog had thickened to the point where he could barely see his hands in front of him. The air felt colder, heavier, as though the mountain itself was pressing down on him. Ethan glanced back, half expecting to see the woodcutter following him, but the path behind was empty. Still, the man's words lingered in his mind. "Not everything wants you to leave." As he adjusted his pack, he noticed the marks he had made earlier on the trees were once again missing. It was as if the forest was erasing his presence. "Focus," he muttered to himself, shaking off the rising panic. He reached for his compass, but its needle still spun wildly, refusing to settle. He stuffed it back into his pocket, took a deep breath, and pressed on. Ethan hadn't gone far when he felt it. A prickle at the back of his neck, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. He froze, his eyes scanning the fog for any movement. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, in the corner of his vision, he caught a glimpse of a shadow, vague, humanoid, and impossibly quick. It darted between the trees, disappearing before he could fully register it. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice echoing through the mist. No answer, just silence. Ethan reached for the salt pouch at his waist, his fingers trembling slightly. He threw a handful in a circle around himself and clutched a small protective charm Gabriel had given him. The air felt heavier, the silence more oppressive. Another shadow flickered to his right, then to his left. Each time it grew closer, more defined. Whatever it was, it wasn't human. Ethan took a deep breath and began to chant a protective incantation under his breath. His voice wavered at first but grew stronger with each word. The shadows hesitated, retreating slightly, as if repelled by the sound. When he finished, the fog seemed to thin, and the oppressive feeling lifted, if only slightly. But Ethan knew this wasn't over. The mountain had more in store for him. The fog wrapped tightly around the forest, muting every sound and obscuring everything more than a few feet away. Ethan pressed forward, his pulse quickening with each step. The oppressive silence was broken by a faint rustling sound ahead. He squinted into the mist and saw her, a woman carrying a basket. She appeared out of nowhere, her outline hazy and surreal in the dim light. She moved with a calm, almost ethereal grace, her head slightly bowed. Ethan hesitated. Someone else on the mountain? At this hour? "Hello," he called out, his voice cautious but firm. The woman stopped and turned toward him. Her face was pale but striking, with sharp features that seemed too perfect, too flawless. She smiled faintly, but her eyes remained cold and distant. "Are you lost?" she asked, her voice soft, almost melodic. "Yes," Ethan replied, trying to keep his tone steady. "I'm trying to find my way down the mountain. Do you know the way?" The woman nodded slowly. "I do. I just came from there." She raised the basket slightly. "I was gathering fruit. You can walk with me if you'd like." Ethan stepped closer, noticing the basket was filled with gleaming red berries. The sweet aroma hit him immediately. Too sweet, cloying, and unnatural. It made his head feel light, his thoughts muddled. "Thank you," Ethan said, though his instincts screamed at him to stay on guard. The woman turned and began walking. Her movements were fluid, almost unnaturally so, and her steps made no sound on the forest floor. Ethan followed a few paces behind, his eyes darting between her and the surrounding trees. "So, do you live nearby?" he asked, trying to make conversation and ease his nerves. She tilted her head slightly. "I do. Deep in the forest. It's a quiet place, but peaceful." Her words didn't sit right with him. He had climbed this mountain and seen no signs of life. No trails, no homes, nothing to suggest anyone could live here. Yet her tone was calm, confident, as if she had been here forever. As they walked, Ethan noticed something else. The trees around them were subtly changing. Their bark was darker, almost black, and their gnarled branches reached out like skeletal hands. The further they went, the more twisted and unnatural the forest became. After a few minutes, the woman stopped and turned to face Ethan. She held out the basket, her smile widening slightly. "Would you like one?" she asked, her voice almost hypnotic. "They're sweet and will give you strength for your journey." Ethan stared at the berries, their vibrant red skins glistening with dew. The smell was overpowering now, sickly sweet and intoxicating. His stomach churned at the thought of eating one. "No, thank you," he said quickly, stepping back. "I'm not hungry." The woman's smile faltered, and for the briefest moment, something flickered in her expression. An edge of irritation, or perhaps disappointment. "Are you sure?" she pressed, holding the basket closer to him. "You've been walking a long time. A little nourishment can't hurt." Ethan tightened his grip on his pack. "I appreciate it, but I really need to focus on finding my way down." Her smile faded completely, replaced by a blank, emotionless stare. She lowered the basket, her fingers tightening around its handle. "Suit yourself." As the woman turned to walk away, Ethan felt the air grow colder. The fog thickened again, and the sweet smell of the berries was replaced by a foul, acrid odor. Ethan's head spun, his vision blurred, and he staggered backward. He glanced down and saw the forest floor writhing beneath his feet, like something alive was moving just below the surface. He turned back to the woman, but she was no longer walking away. She was standing still, facing him once more. "You shouldn't have refused," she said, her voice now low and guttural. Her form began to change. Her skin darkened, her eyes hollowed, and her mouth twisted into a cruel, predatory grin. The basket in her hands crumbled into black ash, and the berries fell to the ground, rotting instantly and releasing a putrid stench. Ethan's heart raced. He fumbled for the salt pouch at his waist and threw a handful toward her. The granules sparkled briefly in the dim light before hitting the ground. The woman let out an inhuman shriek, her figure dissolving into a swirling mass of black mist. It surged toward Ethan, tendrils of shadow reaching for him. Ethan didn't wait. He spun on his heels and ran, the fog parting just enough for him to see a faint trail ahead. The misty tendrils followed him, snapping at his heels, but he kept moving, his adrenaline carrying him forward. He reached into his pack, grabbed a protective charm, and held it tightly in his hand. As he ran, he began to chant one of Gabriel's incantations, his voice trembling but determined. Dispel the shadow, break the hold. Let light prevail and truth unfold. The mist hesitated, pulling back slightly, and Ethan used the moment to sprint further down the path. The fog began to thin, the air growing clearer until finally, he broke through into a small clearing. Ethan collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. The mountain was quiet again, but he knew the danger wasn't gone. Whatever haunted this place wasn't done with him yet. Ethan steadied his breathing as he knelt in the clearing. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint rustle of the wind through the trees. He glanced around, trying to orient himself, but the fog still clung to the forest like a living thing. Then, in the distance, he saw it, a faint glow flickering through the mist. At first, he thought it might be the moonlight reflecting off something metallic, but as he moved closer, the glow sharpened into the unmistakable outline of lanterns. A village, or so it seemed. Relief flooded through him. People, shelter, maybe I'm finally safe. He adjusted his pack and hurried toward the lights, his footsteps quickening with hope. The village came into view, a cluster of small wooden houses surrounded by dense forest. Dim lanterns swung from posts, their light casting eerie shadows on the dirt paths between the buildings. The air was cold and heavy, carrying a faint metallic tang that made Ethan's skin crawl. "Hello!" Ethan called out, his voice cutting through the stillness. No answer. He walked further in, his boots crunching softly on the ground. The houses were all dark inside, their windows empty and uninviting. Yet the lanterns burned, as if someone had lit them moments ago. He approached the nearest house and knocked. The door creaked open slightly under the force of his knock, revealing a dimly lit interior. A table sat in the center of the room, set for a meal, plates, utensils, even a steaming bowl of soup. But there were no signs of life. Ethan stepped inside cautiously, his senses on high alert. The air inside was thick, stagnant, as if no one had been there for years. Yet the food on the table looked fresh. "Where is everyone?" he muttered, his hand instinctively moving to the pouch of salt at his waist. As Ethan explored the house, a chill ran down his spine. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lantern light outside seemed amplified, unnatural. He turned toward the window and froze. Outside, in the shadows between the houses, shapes began to move. At first, they were faint, just flickers of black against the mist. But as he stared, they grew more defined. Figures, human-like but distorted, shuffled silently through the village. Their heads turned toward him in unison, though they had no faces, just blank voids where their features should have been. Ethan stumbled backward, his heart pounding. One of the figures stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. It stopped just outside the house, tilting its head as if listening. The door creaked open slightly, though Ethan hadn't touched it. Ethan didn't wait to find out what the figures wanted. He grabbed a handful of salt and threw it across the threshold, slamming the door shut. The figures outside recoiled, their shapes distorting like smoke caught in a gust of wind. But they didn't retreat. Instead, they began to circle the house, their faceless heads peering through the windows. One of them raised a hand and pressed it against the glass, leaving a black, tar-like smear that slowly dripped down. "This isn't real," Ethan whispered to himself, clutching a protective charm. But the fear in his chest told him otherwise. He began to chant an incantation, his voice shaky but growing stronger with each word. The figures outside faltered, their movements slowing. One by one, they began to dissolve, fading into the mist like shadows before the dawn. When the last one disappeared, the house fell silent again. Ethan stayed frozen in place, his heart pounding, until he finally found the courage to move. As Ethan stepped outside, he noticed the village was changing. The houses, once solid and structured, now appeared warped, their edges blurring and shifting as if they were melting into the fog. The lanterns flickered violently before winking out one by one. Then came the sound, a low, guttural hum that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. Ethan stumbled back, watching as the village dissolved into the mist, leaving only the forest behind. He was alone again, the weight of the silence heavier than before. Ethan tightened his pack and adjusted the straps. His body ached, his mind was foggy, but he knew he couldn't stop now. Whatever force had conjured the village wasn't going to let him go so easily. He needed to get off the mountain and fast. As he turned to leave, he glanced over his shoulder one last time. For a moment, he thought he saw a faint glow where the village had been, like the flicker of a dying flame. Then it was gone. Ethan trudged through the forest, his breath shallow and uneven. The mountain had thrown everything at him. Deceptive villagers, faceless figures, and illusions meant to break his resolve. But he was still standing. His body ached. His mind was worn thin, yet a faint hope burned within him. He was alive, and that meant he still had a chance. As he climbed over a ridge, the fog began to thin. Above him, the stars shone faintly through gaps in the tree canopy, their light offering a small measure of comfort. For the first time in hours, the oppressive weight of the mountain seemed to lift, if only slightly. Then he saw it, a familiar carving on a tree trunk. One of his marks. Relief surged through him. I'm on the right track. He quickened his pace, scanning for more marks to guide him back to safety. But his relief was short-lived. Behind him, the forest stirred. The faint sound of crunching leaves echoed through the trees, steady and deliberate. Ethan's blood ran cold. Whatever it was following him. He glanced over his shoulder but saw nothing. The footsteps stopped as soon as he did. For a moment, all he could hear was the pounding of his heart. When he began moving again, so did the sound. The unseen pursuer was closer now, its presence palpable in the chilling air. Ethan gripped the protective charm in his pocket, muttering an incantation under his breath. The words felt hollow against the mountain's vast silence. The crunching steps turned into a sudden rush. Ethan spun around just in time to see it. A towering, shifting shadow with no discernible form, its edges bleeding into the mist. The air around it grew colder, heavier, as if the very space it occupied was being drained of life. The shadow surged forward, and Ethan reacted instinctively. He threw a circle of salt around himself, the granules glinting faintly in the dim starlight. The shadow recoiled, its form writhing in frustration, but it didn't retreat. Ethan knew the salt circle wouldn't hold for long. He gripped Gabriel's charm tightly, drawing on every ounce of strength and focus he had left. By the light, I banish this darkness. By the truth, I break this illusion, he shouted, his voice echoing through the forest. The shadow faltered, its edges flickering like dying embers. But it didn't vanish. Instead, it surged higher, towering over Ethan like a wave about to crash. Ethan clenched his teeth, his voice steady despite the terror threatening to overwhelm him. I will not fear you. I will not be broken by you. With those words, he raised the charm high, its surface glowing faintly with a soft, warm light. The shadow shrieked, a sound that pierced the air like nails on glass. It lashed out, tendrils of darkness colliding with the salt circle and dissipating into thin air. The light from the charm grew brighter, its warmth spreading outward. Finally, the shadow dissolved, leaving nothing but the faint rustle of leaves in its wake. The forest seemed to exhale, the tension that had gripped the air now fading. Ethan lowered the charm, his hands trembling. He stepped out of the salt circle cautiously, scanning the trees for any lingering threats. The mountain, it seemed, had finally relented. He spotted another mark on a nearby tree and followed it. The marks led him down a narrow, winding path, and after what felt like an eternity, he saw the flicker of warm light in the distance. When Ethan reached the small cabin at the mountain's base, his legs nearly gave out. Gabriel was waiting at the table inside, a steaming cup of tea in his hands. He looked up as Ethan stumbled through the door. "You made it," Gabriel said simply. Ethan dropped his pack and collapsed into a chair, his body too drained for words. Gabriel handed him the tea, his gaze steady but approving. "You did well," Gabriel continued. "The mountain tests more than just your strength. It tests your will, your instincts. You survived because you trusted yourself." Ethan nodded, his hands warming around the cup. The memories of the night were already starting to feel distant, like a fading nightmare. But he knew he'd never forget the lessons the mountain had taught him. As Ethan sat by the fire that night, he couldn't help but glance back toward the dark outline of the mountain. He had faced its horrors and emerged stronger, but he knew this was only a small part of the journey. Every test Gabriel gave him seemed to uncover new depths of his own resilience, and new terrors that awaited him in the shadows. Gabriel's voice broke the silence. "You've done well tonight, but remember, each challenge only prepares you for what's ahead. The path we walk, it never gets easier." Ethan didn't answer, but he understood. The mountain's trials were over, but the darkness of the world wasn't done with him yet. Somewhere out there, another challenge was already waiting. Thank you for joining Ethan's intense journey in the cursed mountain. Here's a question for you. Imagine you're alone in a dense, eerie forest and encounter a calm, mysterious stranger offering to guide you. Would you follow them, or would you trust your instincts and stay away? Tell us your choice in the comments below. We'd love to hear how you'd handle a situation like this. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more thrilling adventures in The Apprentice and The Hunter, Dark Forces Unleashed. Stay spooky.